The wind carved through the canyon walls like a razor, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh winter night in the high desert of Wyoming. Samuel "Sam" Mackenzie pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his shoulders as he stirred the thin broth bubbling over his modest campfire. The flames danced against the weathered stone outcropping that had served as his shelter for the past 3 days, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness beyond. At 62 years old, Sam had become a ghost of the American frontier, a relic from an era when cattle drives stretched across vast expanses of untamed land, and cowboys were the unsung heroes of a growing nation. His face, weathered like old saddle leather and marked by decades of sun, wind, and hard living, told the story of a man who had given his life to the open range. Deep lines etched around his steel blue eyes spoke of countless sunrises witnessed from horseback, of storms weathered, and of dreams that had slowly faded like morning mist. The small fire crackled softly, its warmth barely reaching beyond the circle of stones Sam had carefully arranged. His horse, a faithful bay mare named Stella, stood nearby, her reins loosely tied to a gnarled juniper tree. She occasionally stamped her hooves and shook her mane, sensing the approaching storm that the darkening clouds above promised to deliver before dawn. Sam's stomach growled, reminding him that the thin soup he'd prepared from the last of his provisions would have to sustain him until he could make it to the next town. Still 2 hard days' ride through increasingly treacherous terrain. He reached for his dented tin bowl, the same one he'd carried for over 30 years, and was about to ladle the precious broth when the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. The rhythmic clip-clop grew closer, accompanied by the labored breathing of both horse and rider. Sam instinctively placed his hand on the worn grip of his Colt revolver, a precaution learned from decades of encounters with both desperate men and dangerous wildlife. But as the rider emerged from the shadows into the flickering circle of firelight, Sam's weathered features softened with concern rather than suspicion. The stranger was young, maybe 25 or 30, with the pale, soft look of someone unaccustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. His expensive Eastern-style clothing was torn and mud-stained, his face gaunt with exhaustion, and what appeared to be several days without proper food. The horse beneath him, a beautiful chestnut gelding that had clearly seen better days, trembled with fatigue and barely managed to remain standing. "Please," the young man called out, his voice cracking with desperation. "I've been riding for days. I'm lost. And my horse, I think she's about to collapse." Sam studied the stranger for a long moment, taking in the genuine fear in the man's eyes and the way his hands shook as he gripped the reins. This wasn't a threat. This was someone in genuine distress, far from home, and clearly unprepared for the unforgiving nature of the Wyoming wilderness. "Easy there, son," Sam said in his gravelly voice, rising slowly from his position by the fire. "Light down from that horse and bring her over here. There's room by the fire and she looks like she needs rest more than you do." The stranger dismounted with obvious relief, his legs nearly buckling as his feet touched the ground. Up close, Sam could see that the man's lips were chapped and cracked, his eyes sunken with dehydration and exhaustion. The expensive leather boots he wore were designed for city streets, not rocky canyon floors, and had clearly been causing him considerable discomfort. "Name's Thomas," the young man said, extending a trembling hand. "Thomas Whitman. I was traveling to Denver on business when I took what I thought was a shortcut. That was 4 days ago." Sam grasped the offered hand with his own calloused grip. "Sam Mackenzie, and son, there ain't no shortcuts through this country that don't come with a price." As Thomas tended to his exhausted horse with shaking hands, Sam returned to his fire and looked down at his single bowl of soup. The steam rising from the broth seemed to mock him as his stomach cramped with hunger. He had perhaps 2 spoonfuls of thin soup, made from the last of his jerky, a few wild onions he'd found, and water from a nearby spring. It wasn't much, but it was all that stood between him and going to bed with an empty belly. The wind picked up, sending sparks from the fire spiraling into the darkness. Thomas finished caring for his horse and approached the fire, wrapping his arms around himself as he shivered uncontrollably. His teeth chattered as he spoke. "I haven't eaten in 2 days, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could make it on what I packed, but I never imagined." Sam looked at the young man, really looked at him. Beneath the expensive clothes and city-soft features, he saw something that reminded him of his own son, who had died of pneumonia 15 years earlier. The same determined jaw, the same stubborn pride that kept him from begging even when he was clearly desperate. Without hesitation, Sam picked up his bowl and held it out to Thomas. "Here, son, get this in you before you catch your death." Thomas stared at the offered bowl in disbelief. "I can't take your food, you need it too." "I've been hungry before," Sam replied simply. "You look like you haven't. Besides, a man my age can skip a meal or two. You're young enough that you still got places to go and things to do." The gesture seemed to break something inside Thomas. Tears welled in his eyes as he accepted the bowl with trembling hands. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks," Sam said, settling back against the rock wall. "Just eat up and get your strength back." As Thomas consumed the soup with obvious gratitude, Sam told him stories of the old days, of cattle drives that stretched from Texas to Montana, of nights spent under stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck, of a time when the West was still wild and full of promise. The wind continued to howl outside their small circle of warmth, but inside the shelter of the rocks, two strangers had found a moment of human connection in the vast loneliness of the frontier. Neither man knew that this simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would transform both their lives forever. The first pale fingers of dawn crept across the Wyoming sky, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold. Sam Mackenzie stirred from his restless sleep, his old bones protesting against the hard ground and the night's bitter cold. The fire had died to glowing embers, and frost covered everything beyond the shelter of the rock overhang. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he quietly added kindling to coax the flames back to life. Across the dying fire, Thomas Whitman slept deeply for the first time in days, wrapped in Sam's spare blanket. The young man's face had regained some color after the previous night's meal, though dark circles still shadowed his eyes. His expensive chestnut horse stood nearby, looking considerably better after a night's rest, and the handful of oats Sam had shared from his own meager supplies. Sam's stomach cramped painfully, reminding him of his sacrifice the night before. He had no food left, not even the wild roots and berries that had sustained him during his leanest times. Water from the nearby spring would have to suffice until they reached the next settlement, still a day and a half away, through increasingly difficult terrain. As the sun climbed higher, Thomas began to stir. He sat up slowly, wincing as his city-soft muscles protested against the night spent on hard ground. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as he took in his surroundings, but then his eyes found Sam tending the fire, and memory returned. "Mr. Mackenzie," Thomas said, his voice still rough with sleep, "I want you to know what you did last night, sharing your food with a complete stranger. I've never encountered such kindness." Sam waved dismissively, his weathered hands busy with the fire. "Any decent man would have done the same. You were in need." "No," Thomas insisted, struggling to his feet. "Not any man. I've traveled extensively for my business, from Boston to San Francisco, through towns and cities across this country. I've seen how people treat strangers, especially when resources are scarce." He paused, studying the older man's profile. "What you did was extraordinary." Thomas reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio, its expensive craftsmanship standing in stark contrast to the rough wilderness around them. From within, he pulled out several documents and what appeared to be a substantial roll of bills. "Please," he said, extending the money toward Sam. "Let me repay you. This is more than enough to buy provisions in the next town, and you can keep the rest as thanks for saving my life." Sam's jaw tightened, and for the first time since Thomas had arrived, his expression hardened. "Put that away, son. Right now." The sharp edge in Sam's voice made Thomas step back, but he held his ground. "I don't understand. I'm trying to show my gratitude." "You think I helped you for money?" Sam's steel blue eyes flashed with something between hurt and anger. "You think that's the kind of man I am?" "No, that's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Sam stood slowly, his full height and decades of hard living lending him an imposing presence despite his age. "That poor folks like me only do good deeds when there's profit in it." Thomas's face flushed red. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. In my world, in business, everything has a price. I thought—" "Your world ain't this world," Sam interrupted, gesturing toward the vast wilderness surrounding them. "Out here, a man's worth isn't measured by what's in his wallet. It's measured by what he's willing to do when nobody's watching, and there's nothing in it for him." The tension between them stretched like a taut rope. Thomas looked down at the money in his hands, and Sam could see the young man struggling to understand a concept that seemed foreign to his urban sensibilities. "I've spent my whole life," Thomas said quietly, "in a world where every favor comes with expectations, where kindness is a negotiation tactic, where trust is a luxury few can afford." He looked up at Sam with something approaching wonder. I genuinely don't know how to respond to someone who expects nothing in return. Sam's expression softened slightly. He recognized the sincerity in Thomas's confusion, the genuine struggle of a man trying to navigate unfamiliar moral territory. "Tell you what, son," Sam said, settling back down by the fire. "You want to repay me? Then remember this feeling. Remember what it's like to receive help when you truly need it, with no strings attached. And someday, when you come across someone else who's lost and hungry and scared, you'll know what to do." Thomas slowly returned the money to his portfolio, his hands trembling slightly, not from cold this time, but from something deeper. "In Boston, I work for my father's shipping company. We deal in contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I negotiate deals that affect the livelihoods of hundreds of people." He paused, staring into the flames. "But I've never done anything as important as what you did last night, have I?" "Important's a relative word," Sam replied, but there was approval in his voice now. "What matters is that you're starting to understand the difference between the price of something and its value." As they prepared to break camp, Thomas insisted on helping Sam with every task, despite his obvious inexperience with frontier life. He struggled with the knots on his horse's bridle, fumbled with his bedroll, and nearly scattered the fire's ashes into the wind. But he persevered with determination that reminded Sam of his younger self. "Mr. Mackenzie," Thomas said as they prepared to mount their horses, "would you mind if I rode with you to the next town? I realize I still don't know the way," and he hesitated, then continued with honest vulnerability. "I'd like to learn more about your way of seeing the world." Sam looked at the young man, really looked at him. The expensive clothes were still there, the soft hands and city pallor remained, but something had changed in Thomas's eyes. There was a hunger there now that had nothing to do with food. "Reckon that'd be fine," Sam said, swinging up onto Stella's back with practiced ease. "But I should warn you, the trail ahead's got some rough patches. You sure that fancy horse of yours is up for it?" Thomas patted his chestnut's neck with newfound affection. "We'll manage. After what we've been through, I think we can handle whatever comes next." As they rode out of the canyon into the growing daylight, neither man realized that their conversation had been overheard by watchful eyes hidden among the rocks above, eyes that belonged to people who understood the significance of what they had witnessed far better than either the giver or receiver of that simple act of kindness. The morning sun climbed steadily into a clear blue sky, and the two unlikely companions began their journey toward town, and toward a destiny that would exceed both their wildest expectations. The sun had reached its zenith when Sam and Thomas crested the ridge overlooking the valley that would lead them to Willow Creek, the nearest settlement. The harsh Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly before them, rolling hills covered in sagebrush and scattered juniper trees, with the promise of the small frontier town still hours away through the winding canyon below. Thomas had proven to be better company than Sam had initially expected. Despite his city upbringing, the young man possessed a keen intelligence and genuine curiosity about the world beyond his previous experience. As they rode, he peppered Sam with questions about life on the frontier, about cattle drives and the changing West, listening intently to every story the older man shared. "My father always said the frontier was dying," Thomas mused as they guided their horses down a particularly steep section of trail. "That progress and civilization would make men like you obsolete." Sam chuckled, though there was little humor in the sound. "Your father might be right about that. Ain't many of us left, and fewer each year. The big ranches are buying up the small spreads, and barbed wires cutting up the open range. Used to be a man could ride from Texas to Montana without crossing a fence. Do you regret it? The changes, I mean." Sam considered the question as Stella picked her way carefully between loose stones. "Progress ain't necessarily a bad thing, son. Towns need law and order. Families need schools and doctors. But sometimes I wonder if we're losing something important in all the rush to civilize everything." "What do you mean?" "The knowing that you can depend on your neighbor, even if he's a stranger. The understanding that out here we're all just trying to survive, so we help each other." Sam gestured toward the vast wilderness around them. "In a place like this, a man's word and his willingness to help others is worth more than gold. That's getting harder to find in the civilized world." Thomas rode in thoughtful silence for several minutes, clearly processing Sam's words. The only sounds were the steady clip-clop of their horses' hooves on stone and the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. It was Thomas who first heard it, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He reined in his horse and looked around with confusion. "Mr. Mackenzie, do you hear that?" Sam had already stopped, his weathered face tilted toward the sound. His experienced ears recognized what Thomas's could not yet distinguish. Riders. he said simply. "A lot of them." The rumbling grew louder, and soon Thomas could make out individual hoofbeats, many horses moving together at a steady pace. But instead of the alarm he expected to see on Sam's face, the old cowboy looked puzzled, almost curious. "So they're coming up the main trail from the south," Sam observed, standing slightly in his stirrups to get a better view, moving with purpose but not in any hurry. Strange. Then they appeared around a bend in the canyon, 30 riders moving in loose formation, their silhouettes dark against the afternoon sun. As they drew closer, both Sam and Thomas could see that these weren't ordinary travelers. The riders moved with the easy confidence of men who had spent their lives in the saddle, their clothing and equipment marking them as cowboys and ranchers from across the territory. Leading the group was a tall man with silver hair and a magnificent black stallion. Behind him rode men of various ages, some young, some middle-aged, others bearing the weathered look of long-time frontier veterans. What struck Thomas most was the diversity of the group. Some wore the practical clothing of working cowboys, others sported the more formal attire of successful ranchers, and a few displayed the distinctive gear of different tribal affiliations. As the riders approached, Sam began to recognize faces, men he had worked with years or even decades ago, others he knew only by reputation. There was Jake Morrison, who had been trail boss on the Great Drive of '78. Behind him rode the Sanchez brothers, whose family had been running cattle in these parts since before the territory was officially established. Even old Chief Standing Bear was there, his gray braids flowing beneath a wide-brimmed hat, representing the growing cooperation between ranchers and the local tribal communities. The lead rider raised his hand, and the entire group came to a halt just 50 yards away. In the sudden silence, the silver-haired man dismounted and approached on foot, his spurs chiming softly with each step. "Sam Mackenzie," the man called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Been looking for you." Sam recognized the voice before he could make out the face clearly. "Frank Dalton? That you, Frank?" "It is indeed." Frank Dalton had been one of the most respected ranchers in Wyoming territory for over 30 years, a man whose word was considered as good as any legal contract. His presence here, leading this unusual gathering, was both surprising and intriguing. Sam dismounted and walked forward to meet his old friend, leaving Thomas to wonder at this unexpected development. The two men clasped hands in the manner of those who had shared hardships and trusted each other with their lives. "Frank, what brings you and all these boys out here? This ain't exactly a social gathering spot." Frank's weathered face broke into a grin. "Actually, Sam, it is today. We've been riding since before dawn, looking for you specifically." "Looking for me? Why?" Instead of answering directly, Frank turned and gestured toward the group of riders. From among them, a young man emerged, not much older than Thomas, but with the calloused hands and confident bearing of someone raised on the frontier. He carried a guitar across his shoulder and approached with obvious respect for the older men. "This here's Johnny Rivera," Frank explained, "son of Maria Rivera, who runs the boarding house in Willow Creek. Johnny's got something he wants to share with you." Johnny stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Mackenzie, my mother sent word through the territory about what you did yesterday evening, about sharing your last meal with a stranger who was lost and hungry." Sam frowned, glancing between Johnny and Frank. "I don't understand. How could your mother know anything about that?" "Because," Frank said, his grin widening, "the stranger you helped wasn't as lost as he thought. After you fell asleep, he managed to find his way to town, and he told everyone he met about the kindness of an old cowboy who gave away his only food to help someone in need." Thomas, who had been listening with growing amazement, suddenly understood. The observers in the rocks hadn't been mysterious watchers. They had been his own sense of direction finally returning as the night wore on, allowing him to find the main trail after Sam had fallen asleep. "But that still doesn't explain," Sam began. "It explains everything," Frank interrupted. "Word spread from ranch to ranch, from town to town. In a time when kindness is becoming scarce, when people are forgetting what it means to be neighborly, your simple act reminded everyone of what the best of us can be." Johnny stepped forward again, this time lifting his guitar. "Mr. Mackenzie, we rode all this way because we wanted to do something for you. Something to show our appreciation for keeping alive the spirit that makes this frontier worth preserving." As Johnny began to tune his guitar, the other riders dismounted and formed a loose circle. From their saddlebags, they began to unpack supplies: blankets, preserved meat, bags of grain, coffee, and other necessities that Sam recognized as enough provisions to last him through the harsh winter ahead. "We also wanted to share something else," Johnny continued, his fingers finding the first chords. "A song we wrote in your honor." The canyon fell silent, except for the soft whisper of wind through sagebrush as Johnny Rivera's fingers found their rhythm on the guitar strings. The 30 riders had formed a respectful circle around Sam, their weathered faces reflecting the afternoon sun and something deeper, a reverence for the values that had built their frontier community. Sam stood in the center, overwhelmed by the sight before him. Men he had worked alongside decades ago, young cowboys he had never met, successful ranchers who commanded respect across the territory, and tribal elders whose wisdom bridged two worlds, all united by a simple story of human kindness. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. Johnny's voice rose clear and strong in the desert air, carrying a melody that seemed to capture the vast loneliness and enduring hope of the American West. There's an old cowboy riding the high desert trail, where the wind tells stories that time cannot pale. With a heart big as Texas and hands worn by years, he's forgotten by most, but to us he's a peer. When the stranger came calling on that cold winter night, lost and hungry and filled up with fright, old Sam didn't question, didn't hesitate long. He gave his last supper and proved honors not gone. Ho, sing for the cowboy who remembers the way, when neighbors were family at the end of the day, when a man's word was golden and his heart was his guide, and kindness to strangers was a source of pride. As Johnny sang, something remarkable happened. One by one, the other riders began to join in, their voices creating a harmony that echoed off the canyon walls like a prayer. Some knew the words already. The song had spread as quickly as the story itself through the tight-knit frontier communities. Others hummed along, adding their voices to the growing chorus. Sam felt tears building in his eyes for the first time in years. These men, these proud, independent frontier veterans, had ridden for hours through difficult terrain not for profit or obligation, but to honor a simple act of human decency. In their weathered faces, he saw reflection of his own values, validation that the code he had lived by was not obsolete but treasured. Thomas watched from beside his horse, his own eyes moist with emotion. In his world of contracts and negotiations, of calculated relationships and strategic friendships, he had never witnessed anything like this raw, authentic expression of community gratitude. The song wasn't just about Sam, it was about preserving something essential that the modern world seemed determined to forget. When the last notes faded into the desert silence, Frank Dalton stepped forward again. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a beautifully crafted wool blanket, its deep blue color interwoven with patterns that spoke of both practical warmth and artistic beauty. "This here's from the women of Willow Creek," Frank explained, offering the blanket to Sam. "Maria Rivera, Mrs. Patterson from the general store, even old Martha who runs the schoolhouse. They heard the story and wanted to contribute something made with their own hands." Sam accepted the blanket with reverence, running his fingers over the intricate stitching. "Frank, I don't know what to say. All this for sharing a bowl of soup?" "No, Sam," Frank replied, his voice carrying the wisdom of his years. "This is for reminding us who we really are. In a time when people are forgetting how to be neighbors, when folks are more concerned with getting ahead than helping others, you showed us that the best of the frontier spirit is still alive." Jake Morrison, the old trail boss, stepped forward with a leather satchel. "Jerky and hardtack from my ranch, enough to last you through the winter. And coffee. Real coffee, not that chicory substitute." The Sanchez brothers approached together, carrying bags of grain and oats. "For your horse," Miguel explained in accented English. "She deserves good feed for carrying such a good man." One by one, each rider came forward with contributions. Warm clothing, preserved foods, ammunition, medical supplies, tools, everything a frontier man might need to survive the coming winter in comfort rather than mere subsistence. But more than the material gifts, each man offered something more precious. A handshake, a word of respect, acknowledgement that Sam Mackenzie represented the best of what they all aspired to be. Chief Standing Bear was among the last to approach. The elderly tribal leader carried a small pouch made of soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork. "This contains tobacco and sage," he said in careful English, his weathered face solemn with respect. "In our tradition, we honor those who show true generosity of spirit. You gave when you had little to give. This makes you wealthy in ways that matter most." Sam accepted the pouch with both hands, understanding that he was receiving not just a gift, but recognition from a culture that valued generosity above all other virtues. As the gift-giving concluded, Thomas stepped forward. The transformation in the young businessman was remarkable. Gone was the uncertainty and confusion of the previous day, replaced by something approaching clarity of purpose. "Mr. Mackenzie," Thomas said, his voice steady and determined, "I want everyone here to know that I was the stranger you helped. I was lost, hungry, and probably would have died in that canyon if not for your kindness." He paused, looking around the circle of men. "But more than saving my life, you changed it. You showed me what real wealth looks like." Thomas reached into his saddlebags and withdrew his leather portfolio. But instead of the money Sam had rejected the day before, he pulled out a different kind of document. "I've written a letter to my father's company, recommending that we establish a permanent trading post in Willow Creek. It will provide jobs for local people and ensure that travelers through this territory have access to supplies and assistance." He looked directly at Sam. "And I'd like you to manage it if you're willing. Not as charity, but because you understand better than anyone what people really need out here." The offer hung in the air like morning mist. Sam looked around at the faces surrounding him, men who had ridden hard across difficult country to honor him, who had brought gifts not from obligation but from genuine respect and affection. "Thomas," Sam said slowly, "that's a generous offer. More generous than I deserve." "You deserve far more than any of us can give," Frank interjected. "The question is, will you accept? Will you let us help you the way you helped a stranger in need?" Sam looked at Stella, then at the supplies now packed on several of the riders' horses, then at the faces of men who had become more than neighbors. They had revealed themselves as family in the truest sense of the word. "Well," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "I reckon a man would be a fool to refuse such generous neighbors." The cheer that rose from the 30 riders echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to reach toward the endless Wyoming sky. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the high desert, Sam Mackenzie realized that he was no longer a forgotten cowboy riding alone through an indifferent world. He was surrounded by a community that remembered the importance of kindness, and his simple act of sharing soup with a stranger had reminded them all of who they wanted to be. The frontier was changing, but its heart, its capacity for generosity and mutual support, would endure as long as there were people willing to give their last bowl of soup to someone in need.